Yep.
Okay.
There's more people coming. I'm not seeing it yet.
There's a chair here.
Thank you.
It's not possible to get it over here.
I think we're full. Do we want to turn the air conditioning on?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, let's get started.
I hope this is not heating with air conditioning.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation, and it's been great to talk to people here so far. My name is Tom Evans from University of Arizona, and Zach Gaida was also here from the University of Arizona. Zach Gaida was also here from the University of Arizona. And what I did here was to try to put together two pieces of different projects. So one is focused on some of our work in rural areas, and one is focused on our work in urban areas. And so I just picked a sampling of things as a way to catalyze discussion. So it's not a comprehensive overview of all the projects, but it's a little bit of pieces. So this work is in collaboration with lots of people. Most of these are investigators at other universities, but Jordan Blecking at Indiana University now currently, and Cascade Tucholsky have done a lot of the data collection as part of this project. And then the collaborative team involves environmental scientist Kelly Kaler at UC Santa Barbara, Kathy Bayless, who's an ag economist at Illinois, Megan Konar, also at Illinois, she's a hydrologist, and then Lyndon Estes is in environmental science. So I'll show one side of this today, but it's a collaborative team effort, as many of these things are. So again, I'm going to talk about these two parts, about 15 minutes on each one. So one is focused on some of our work in rural areas, trying to use high-frequency mobile phone data collection to understand adaptation to climate change in Zambia and Kenya. And then some newer work that's kind of the reason that brought us here, focused on urban food security assessments and ways of doing that kind of data collection. So I'll start with the rural part. And this is kind of motivated by this idea of looking at the scale of drought events in sub-Saharan Africa and understanding with different scale drought events, what's the magnitude of impact on rural food security, and then how does that then lead to different kinds of adaptation strategies from farmers. And I'll talk a lot about Zambia today just in the interest of time, and we also have the same work going on in Kenya, but I'll talk about Zambia specifically. And in Zambia, there's a unimodal precipitation sequence. There's an onset of rains in October, November, December, and then the end of the harvest season is kind of around April. And I mention this because the timing of this rainy season has a lot to do with the way that we've designed our research strategies. So this is around the time when most farmers would be planting, and then if there's a late onset of, I need a clicker, I'm sorry that I'm in your way. I don't think that it's a clicker, unfortunately. Yeah. But yeah, if there's a late onset of rains, then some farmers may choose to wait and then plant in December. And so that's one of the key decisions that we're looking at. So it's okay, So the key is that depending on how farmers are allocating those planting decisions, we see different duration of the growing season overall, and that has an impact on end season harvest. So these are our data trying to look at, well, how many farmers are planted by the second week of November, the third week of November, and so on. And so the peak is here, but there's some farmers that are putting some plant seeds in the ground much earlier, and some that are waiting as late as December. And so what are the implications there? Are that, well, they may be using, and I don't expect you can read this, but the key is that there are obviously these different cultivars. So there's two fundamental decisions. When are the farmers planting? What cultivar are they planting? Is it a 3-month variety or a 6-month variety? And then how does that influence the end season harvest? So I think this is probably a quote that will be familiar to many people, but it's from Carletto. So knowledge about agriculture and its impact on welfare and equity is limited by the lack of available high quality and consistent data on farm households. So this isn't to say that data necessarily leads to better decision making, but there are these huge kind of data gaps that really need to be addressed in order for us to understand what's happening. So next slide. So what we did was try to use different monitoring and investigation methods. So this is kind of the bread and butter, we can say. We, like, one time per year, go in and do one big extensive survey with 300 questions. Really expensive. You've got to drive all over the country to do it, and some countries are spending a lot of resources in getting amazing data, but not every country can do this kind of thing. The next option is something like FuseNet, where you can use actors on the ground to give you assessments of what's happening. Also, we have remote sensing-based approaches that can give you some perspective of what the above-ground biomass is and the possible in-season yields. But these are all kind of observations and not necessarily leading you to insight into what decisions farmers are making. So what we've done is partly in parallel and I can say inspiration with MVAM is trying to harmonize the temporal frequency of environmental data where we can get hourly information from meteorological sensors and trying to get that same high resolution frequency, temporal resolution on the social side. So this is not unfamiliar to all of you here at World Food Program. Next slide. So, what our focus has been primarily not on trying to redevelop the food consumption scores or food metrics, but we're trying to look at the decisions and the timing of those. So we're trying to look at what cultivars are planted, when they plant it, how they manage it, so are they fertilizing, weeding, and we do this for many, many farmers, and we try to match this to real-time, high-density meteorological data, and our approach has been using SMS primarily, but we can also use voice calls as well. And so, yes, and so the idea is to try to harmonize the frequency of the environmental data and the social data. So next slide. And yeah, okay, now next one. All right, so what we've done with our SMS-based approach is, I think, familiar. So we do a series of flows. So let's go to the next clicks here, please. Maybe one more time. Yeah, so we have this branch set of questions. Based on the responses to the first question, they get a series of subsequent questions. And our structure has been where we're sending talk time to farmers each week. We're using this with 1,200 farmers in Zambia and 800 in Kenya. Our response rates have been around 50%. It goes up and down week to week, but on average, we're around 50%. And the farmers are co-located with these meteorological instruments, so we can try to understand if there's a Met station that's saying, yes, it rained this week, there may be 30 farmers within a 2-kilometer radius where half of them say, yes, it did rain, I agree with the Met station, but half farmers, because of the type of precipitation events, might say, no, it didn't rain on my field. And what are the implications of that heterogeneous rainfall for farm decision making? And what we've been doing has been what I can say basic science. So we haven't been trying to do implementations on the ground. We haven't been doing direct information flows back to farmers, but we're starting to pilot that a little bit. Primarily, we've been doing these kind of community summary reports. And so our Met stations are these kinds of devices here. So there's a company actually called Arable that was spun off by one of our collaborators. And let's go to the next slide. And these things are basically automated weather stations. So this is a solar panel on the top here. The surface of this is an acoustic precipitation measurement device. So it records the sound of the rainfall, calibrates that into a rainfall amount. And then there's a spectrometer here, so we can place these inside of a maize field and look at the crop growth over time in 6 bands. It's connected to a cellular network, so the data is being uploaded real time. And then there's humidity and temperature and so on, the kind of standard measurements. Okay, next slide. So yeah, what we're trying to do is really identify how is the rainfall precipitation being distributed both in space and time, and then how are farmers in different areas making decisions, because a young farmer versus an old farmer, or a socially connected farmer, or a very remote farmer will make different decisions. So let's click through here, and keep going, please. Okay, so what we're trying to do is, next slide, please, is look at this kind of sequence. And what we see is different kind of adaptation strategies where, again, some farmers will be planting earlier and later. And we can use SMS, and there's a mechanism and an advantage to using SMS where we can look at kind of a rapid response, but what we're trying to do is use this SMS-based approach to understand the frequency of decision making. So when we do that one-time survey per year, you get a lot of questions answered, but you miss the many, many decisions that are being made. So let's click through to the next slide then. And yeah, the key is to try to reproduce this kind of diagram, and the implications are, if we think about planting on this date versus this date, what is the outcome in terms of yield? And so next slide. So this is a DSAT, just kind of a standard off-the-shelf crop model. And this is a figure for one single maize hybrid cultivar. But what this is basically showing is that if a farmer is either 3 weeks early or 3 weeks late in the quote-unquote optimal planting date, their yield will be about a 20% drop. And so that means that the timing of trying to get the ideal date, which is kind of impossible, but the implication of getting that date quote-unquote wrong are pretty severe in terms of the overall change in end season harvest. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we're doing is this kind of rapid monitoring and assessment over large spatial extents, but I think in slight contrast to what MVAM has been doing, we're really focused on the decision making and adaptation strategies. Not that you aren't, but you're doing this in spades, and we're not focused on the rapid monitoring dimension of this as much as you are. Okay, next slide. So the way that we've structured our program has been focused around this. One of the hardest decisions about how to implement this program is what questions. We can only do 6, 7 questions max. How do you choose which precious 6 or 7 questions you actually choose to ask? And we've partitioned our data collection across the different seasonal kind of crop calendar, basically. So we have a planting season flow, a growing season flow, a harvest season flow, and an inter-season harvest flow. And so if you click just individually, so we have a question here every single week. We ask, did it rain on your main maize field this week? And then click again, please. One more time. And then we ask, if you did plant, then what cultivar did you plant? So we actually have them type in the seed variety if they know it, and if they don't know this actual seed variety, just saying whether it was local maize or early or medium, so we know once these seeds go on the ground in this date, what might the harvest be based on different kinds of precipitation forecasts. Next one. And so during the growing season, we switch and we ask questions like, did you do any piecework on your field this week? Next slide. And one more. And then every single, once per month, we're asking this question, how many bags of maize do you currently have in storage? And I'll circle back on this a little bit later in the presentation. And then we also try to get, in the same way that there in Zambia, for example, there's a mid-season harvest survey, it's called Crop Forecast Survey, in March that says, that asks farmers, well, it's the middle of the growing season, but what do you think the harvest is going to be at the end of the year? And in many cases, that's a better predictor of what the end season harvest is going to be than remote sensing, for example. So we're trying to get this at the farm level, but the contrast is we're getting this once per month as opposed to just one time per year. Okay, next slide, please. And then during the harvest season, we ask questions, did you harvest this week? Next one. What is your total harvest so far? So they might be harvesting over multiple weeks. And then did you sell or buy any maize this week? So we can look at how not just their food consumption patterns are depleting their stocks, but how purchases and selling events might be modifying how much maize they have in storage. So the outcome of this is putting together a data series like this, where this is showing 2 different growing seasons. So the blue bars are rainfall amounts, as reported by our farmers, and the brown line here is the amount of maize in storage. And what we see is this tremendous difference between these 2 different growing seasons. So this is a pretty good rainfall year here. There's an adequate amount of rainfall, and then here's the planting season, here's the growing season, harvest season. And what it shows is that while farmers are depleting their maize stock almost down to nothing, and then all of a sudden they harvest and they bump all the way up to here. But here's a very different agroclimatological season here, where there is this big mid-season dry period in Zambia. And so the actual bump after they harvested in this growing season only actually went up to like maybe 2/3 of what this harvest season was. And the value of this is that we can match these data, the rainfall data, to the food storage data and look at it temporally, which gives us a lot of analytical power that the annual surveys don't give us. So next slide. And so we then tried to partition this to look at, well, if we see some farmers in different categories, what are the distribution of food storage over time for different types of farmers? So we split our data here and analyzed it based on these terciles. And what we see again is that not only do we see very different outcomes based on these two different growing seasons, but the best off farmers, the top tercile, they're bumping up here to like 500 bags of maize, as opposed to in a good season, they're almost twice that. But it's these farmers that are in this lowest tercile here who are almost going down to 0 bags of maize in storage at the end of the growing season. But even at the highest point, they had a very modest amount of food. So these are the households that end up having to very quickly develop some adaptation strategies. Often they become laborers for other farmers who have more land available. So they might be doing day labor like weeding or fertilizing and so on. So this temporal sequence gives us a lot of window into what kinds of decisions different farmers are making. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then we've also tried to pair this with perceptions of rainfall and how farmers are perceiving climate change and how that's then leading to different kinds of cropping decisions. So we're asking these questions, when do you think the rain started in your area? So next slide. And so this is a line, and click one more time, please. So this is, we did this survey back in 2016. We asked them, for all these 800 or 1,200 farmers, when do you think the rain started in your area? And some said it started over here in the 4th week of October. A majority of the farmers, or the peak was here in the 2nd week of November. And a few farmers are saying that the rains are starting as late as December. And these are the farmers that are more likely to be adopting early maturing or 3-month maize varieties versus these farmers who perceive that, well, yeah, the rains are starting pretty early. I have a very long growing season ahead, so I might be doing a 6-month variety for these farmers here. And then we asked them, well, for the previous growing season, when do you think the rain started? And they said, well, yeah, for like the last year, the rains were kind of starting this 1st week of November. And then one more clip, please. And then here's another on the 2012-2013. So we see not a different peak, but we see more farmers that are predicting this earlier season here, and this proportion of farmers is going down over here. And then we said, well, how about 10 years ago, approximately 10 years ago, when do you think the rains were starting? And so people were overwhelmingly saying that, yeah, historically the rains were coming earlier than they're coming now. And this has a big implication for whether they may be, when they choose to plant, how many farmers might be choosing to plant early versus late, and then again, what cultivar they plant. And again, the implications are the longer the growing season, the higher your yield may be. And so missing that optimal planting date has huge implications for that amount of food in storage. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so now I'm going to switch gears totally and jump to this work on household urban food security assessments and what we can call urban food systems. And really these are kind of synchronized a little bit. Obviously rural food production has an outcome on urban food security, but trying to implement these same methodologies of what is the food security status of an urban household is a very different pursuit than these rural households. So click one more time. And so the philosophy or the conceptual approach of our work is trying to use this regional analysis of food sourcing. So if we take Lusaka, Zambia, the capital city here, and say, well, let's look at the distribution of cropland within Zambia and think about, for the city of Lusaka, what is the source of maize within the country? And so there's a huge portion of maize coming from the central part of the country. There's a lot coming from the southern part. And as you get to the northern part of Zambia, there's relatively little maize for this particular rural-urban linkage of food flow from this area down to Lusaka, just as one kind of conceptual representation. Okay, next slide. So this is work that we've been doing in coordination with the Zambia Agricultural Research Institute, ZARI, and focused primarily on household food consumption, using a spatial analysis approach across many residential areas. And we're specifically looking at the role of markets, vendors, and governance. And so very similar analytical design to what your team here is doing in Kinshasa, for example. And yeah, we're using this, what we can say, a food systems approach to urban food security. So next slide. Just kind of click through until let's talk about these. I put too much animation here. So yeah, I think the idea here is just to express that urban food security is very much a product of both intra-household dynamics and external household dynamics. So certainly regional food production and global commodity trade has an influence on urban food security, but then also the local market, the way that those markets are governed and the prices that are set, whether there are street vendors in a local area or not. And then tied to that is these kind of household consumer behavior dynamics. So looking at the regularity of labor opportunities, what's the demographic composition, and then the choice of where and what food to buy. Okay, so next slide. So we did this work in 2016, 2017 in 18 different residential areas in Lusaka, about 800 households. Let's see, about 35 respondents per residential area. We also did data collection on commodity prices in public markets and with street vendors. And then we were also looking at local government and market manager interviews as well to understand the distribution of food within the city of Lusaka. And so this is a perspective, just kind of a spatial representation of the data collection that we've done. We avoided the high-income residential areas because these are not the pockets of food insecurity. And then we were also avoiding the local CBD here. But the red dots here are the open-air markets, and the green dots are the households, just to give you a perspective on how we distributed our data collection. And this is a zoomed-in level here. So there are some residential areas, again, that have these open-air markets and street vendors, but there was actually a big cholera outbreak last year in Lusaka where they prohibited and they told all street vendors they had to close up, and that has a big impact not only on where people can buy food, but also a lot of women get a livelihood from doing street vending. So there's kind of a dual impact on household livelihoods with that kind of outcome. And so what we've been looking at is the food supply chain. So what we found in the city of Lusaka, 2 million people, more than 2 million people, virtually every single vendor is getting their produce, their products, from one single wholesale market, Soweto. More than 80% of all goods that are sold is coming from one single wholesale market. So at 4:30 in the morning, every single vendor gets up, they take some transportation to the wholesale market, purchase what they're going to sell that day, go back to their residential area, and that's what they sell during the year. And so we focused our analysis on the market side on what we can call these kind of indicator species. So Kapenta is a fish, so a source of protein. Tomatoes, rape greens, or onions. And then we also asked about breakfast meal or just maize meal, and then roller meal. So next slide. Not only are the open-air market vendors getting their food from their produce from the wholesale market, this one single wholesale market, but also the street vendors are also getting it sourcing from the same location. Okay, so, and the exception is maize meal or roller meal. So we looked at, are the prices different between the street vendors and the open air markets? And for some cases, the prices are relatively consistent between the market vendors and the street vendors, like tomatoes. Other goods, like onions, click one more time. We see pretty good, more dramatic variability. These bars here are just different residential areas. Next slide, please. And partly here we have an analytical challenge of defining what a medium onion is or what a medium tomato is. Actually, on the ground, the Zambian group they're going out with scales and they'll actually measure a tomato so that if the vendor is saying this is a medium tomato, but they'll get the actual weight measurement of those. And yeah, we've been looking at this kind of spatially explicit design. So this is a relatively high income within the realm of low to middle income residential areas. Charleston is one that's relatively high. This is the low end. We see a pretty dramatic change in price, almost 4 times, 3 times the price in this low income area versus this high income area. Other goods are less volatile to that distribution or variability across residential areas. So next slide. And again, we are looking at this across different residential areas in the spatially explicit design. So we're looking at geolocated households here and their proximity to the open air markets, and we're actually asking them from what market are you purchasing your goods. Next slide. And what we found is when we started analyzing the data, and so here we're using the food consumption score, which obviously was developed for rural contexts, and we've applied it here in this urban context with an understanding that there may be limitations or disadvantages. And so what we found when we looked across all of our residential areas, click one more time, is that there's this fairly dramatic, the red bar is the standard deviation and the blue bar is the mean. And what we found is that even in these relatively higher income residential areas, we see a fairly dramatic heterogeneity of this food consumption score. In other words, it's not only these low income areas where we see many food insecure or lower food insecurity individuals. We see even in these moderate income areas, there are pockets of lower food income households. So next slide. Now, if we look at this with that kind of FCS distribution, what we found is that a vast majority of households are food secure, adequate food security relative to what we consider a rural context. So this is the borderline category here, and this is the food insecure category here based on the thresholds of 2135. Click one more time, and one more time, please. But what we found is that approximately 1 out of 7 households were borderline borderline or below. And the caveat here is that we did this survey 1 time per year. Obviously, this is going to change over time as one may analyze it in May, April, February, and so on. And then we've also utilized that SMS-based approach to try to get that temporal perspective then, because we recognize, again, with that annual survey, you might not catch the exact perfect time. And so for the urban residents, we hypothesized they would be less willing to answer many questions as we were doing in the rural areas. So in the rural areas, we would do about 6 or 7 questions per week. In the urban area, we used a design of just 2 and only 2 questions. And that was a super hard decision of what 2 questions we want to choose. And we ended up with these 2 questions. So number 1 is, how many days of piecework did you do this week? And the second question is, how much money was spent on food this week? And we see this super strong relationship between these 2. And the kind of message or the story here is that to understand what's happening in urban food security environments, this tight coupling between labor availability or labor opportunities and food consumption kind of stands out, in contrast to rural, where labor is certainly important, but the linkage is not as tight. There's also obviously been lots of other work going on in these urban environments. So this is work by Cascade at UC Santa Barbara, and Kelly Kaler, my collaborator there. And so we've been analyzing and looking at the harmonization of the HFIAS score versus the food consumption score. And so we can just plot these 2 scores on a scatter plot, and we can see a pretty noisy distribution depending on which actual measure that we're using to come up with urban food security status. The next slide. And this is just a shout out to the work from the AFSUN group, the African Food Security Urban Network. And so Jane Battersby and colleagues have been doing a lot of assessments in urban areas in Africa using very similar designs. So you also in Kinshasa are using a similar kind of approach of a spatially explicit design, getting data on households, market locations, street vendors, and so on. And so there really is an opportunity for us to create a network of researcher and data products that can hopefully try to harmonize around data survey instrument methodologies. And the last thing I'll mention is that we're recently pivoting because of this AFSA network, which has done amazing work in about almost 20 cities, but they've primarily been focusing on like Johannesburg, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, the major African cities. But if we look at the statistics on where urban residents in these countries live, there's actually a majority of urban residents not in those primary cities. There's more individuals in secondary or tertiary cities. So for example, we've got South Africa here, 74% are outside of Johannesburg. Here we've got 73% of urban individuals in Botswana outside of Gaborone. Here 66% of urban residents in Zambia are outside of Lusaka, for example. And this means that we need to make sure that we're not forgetting these secondary cities as we do these urban assessments. And that's because we see very different kinds of connectivity depending on what kind of urban market it is. So for example, here's Lusaka, and there may be one kind of food distribution or food sourcing for that kind of city, but a secondary city in a more remote part of Lusaka may have tighter linkages, and households in those residential areas may have a farm that's only 45 minutes away, as opposed to a city resident in Lusaka who may have migrated from a location here who doesn't have that same mechanism to rely on proximal rural food production to mitigate food shortages that they may have. Also, in these secondary cities, what you find is there's less governmental services available, and so there's pluses and minuses depending on what kind of urban context you're talking about. But the key is that we need to be coupling our climate data, remote sensing data, and this kind of food flow analysis. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Here's a slide just showing the collaborators in a few papers, and I kind of preemptively put a slide up, the next one, as a way to trigger some conversation topics here. So again, my thanks for letting us come here and visit and present this work, but I hope it's just the kind of start of a conversation about some similar kind of research interests. And I'll stop there. Boy, it is after lunch in a warm room. It's a super bad combination.
Yeah, question. On the first part, so once we know when the optimal planting season was supposed to be in the previous season, and that has a huge impact, and we see that you can double actually the harvest that you can get. I guess to give back to the farmers, right? The kind of product that I would see. I don't know, maybe you said it, but it's given to me. It would be, I guess, to forecast when it's the right moment to plant, right? So maybe, you know, at the end of October, you say, okay, look, the best time to plant is gonna be with an error of 4 days, 5 days in the optimum. This came to my mind as like something that we can operationalize from these kind of results. What would be needed though to support this? Would we need to do the high frequency survey all the time? I guess.
Yeah, it's a couple things. One is just seed availability is huge. So in these more remote locations, trying to get early maturing varieties can be quite a challenge. So relatively remote households may not have, they may be planting a 6-month variety because that's the only variety of maize they can purchase locally. So I think it's partly working with seed companies and getting the distribution of different varieties more distributed.
Because if you have the variety that takes less to grow, it's if you have a season where the rains come late and the only seed variety you have available to you is a 6-month variety, you might not even be able to get a harvest that year. But if you can, maybe the rains come in December and you can find a 3-month variety locally, you can still get some harvest out of that outcome if the seeds are available. So already getting their seeds that take less to grow would have a huge impact on the life of this.
So that would be one. And the second is Many farmers just have one and only one field, and so they have to make kind of it's a gamble. Like, do I put my whole field in a 6-month variety or a 3-month variety? But another strategy is that they can split their field, or if they have another location, they put one field in a 6-month variety and another field in a 3-month variety. And that can help them mitigate the possibility of a bad growing season, with the caveat that if you look at 10 years of climate data, maybe optimally it would be better to plant 6-month variety in both of your fields in terms of if you were looking at the 10-year total harvest. But what farmers are trying to do is to avoid the worst year harvest, and that's where the 3-month, 6-month variety comes in. But that's the issue is what kinds of farmers are already detecting that the rains are changing, and what farmers are still believing that the rains aren't changing, because we see different categories of farmers from our analysis. So part of it is an education and Zambia has a pretty good ag extension network, but clearly we see different perceptions of the rainfall events, and that leads to different farming outcomes.
So finally, if you would meet with the farmer in Zambia, the one advice you would give to them is plant things that take less to grow and plant later.
Or consider using multiple strategies, so consider multiple varieties, and also consider in your local area what's your experience, and can you as a farmer, if you have 2 hectares of land, can you afford to put some land in a late maturing variety and some land in an early maturing variety? And if you're a household that is only has a half hectare of land, then you need to be more risk averse, obviously. You have to be able to feed your family.
Those shifts in was the plot, you have the histogram of the dates, the one with the 10 years before the planting time or the arrival of the rains was far to the earlier part of the year.
Yeah.
Did you verify that against any actual data?
Yeah, it's the same, so I was showing the SMS data, but it's the same signal from the net station data.
10 years back.
Yeah.
Or 10 years is just from farmers.
That slide was their perceptions. But yes, the Met station data does verify the same trend.
The 10 year.
That the rains are coming later. And the other big change is that there's a more frequent mid-season dry periods that are occurring now versus 10, 15 years ago.
Maybe on the food consumption score, I see you have a very critical approach to, let's say, you're quite against the use of food consumption score in urban areas, which probably is true.
Well, keep
no,
going.
sorry, I don't want to.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, did you consider extra hours of food consumption? Did you somehow factor in the consumption of food outside of the house? Because usually it plays a big role.
Yeah.
You did.
Yeah, so we asked what they were eating and where they were getting it from.
Okay, but when you calculate the food consumption score, do you only refer to the question, what did you consume inside the house?
Yeah, so the drawback is that we weren't getting individual level data, so I think
We are sharing the same problem,
Yeah.
but we somehow tried to dodge this problem by including at least those foods or those ingredients of foods consumed quite regularly outside of the house, which are much more common than you would think because of children eating in canteens in school or at the end there is a significant gap, and I wonder if not including it could explain the high variability or standard deviation regardless of the income.
Yeah, no,
average income of the different neighborhoods, because it's quite common that some people have the habit of going out to eat for various reasons.
Or if they're gone all day working, they might get
Exactly.
something. Yeah, so definitely, and I wasn't trying to be critical of the SCS because it's really helpful for consistency, and so we've used it in our analysis for that reason. So I don't criticize it. I more reflect on what are we missing by using the food consumption score that's important for urban areas. And I totally agree that I wish that we had done a better job of looking at, well, here's the respondent that we're talking to, often the woman who's doing the cooking because she's familiar with what the family is eating. And if we had the resources, it would have been great to also do individual level surveys to get at exactly what you're talking about. And I think that's super important, and we didn't do it, so I totally agree with you.
No, I agree with you that it's quite weak in urban areas, especially. I would tend to prefer a house of dietary diversity score, talking about dietary diversity in urban areas, than in adding the complexity of weights associated to foods which are quite nutritious and that happen to be more frequently consumed in urban areas as opposed to rural.
Yeah.
So in a way you risk to standardize basically the results on the higher side. That's why very often you have high food consumption score even in areas which are poor or in areas which are, because anyway you have access to either processed food, junk food, etc., which is considered nutritious from our perspective when in fact it's not.
Yeah, yeah, and increases there. So I think that our money spent on food is underrepresented for that exact reason. This is the woman respondent is talking about how much is being purchased on a weekly basis, but a lot of that outside the household food consumption expenditures is not being necessarily well represented by this line here. And yeah, the quality of food is critically important. We can't just look at these quantity measures. But that then gets into nutrition, and we were doing this, we couldn't do a comprehensive analysis in this kind of way where we were really looking at nutritional benefits as well, but I think that's where the work needs to go next.
You briefly mentioned about the question of seasonality in urban context as well, and you put this chart up where you talk about availability of labor being important, but how else do you address this question of seasonality in urban context?
So we've been looking a little bit at migration. So there's obviously a lot of individuals who might come to the city for a portion of the year, but then during the growing season when there's a big labor demand on the rural households, they might go back and work there. So we've been looking at intra-season migration a little bit. It's hard to get that data because it's individual level data, but that's another dimension where we've been looking at seasonality.
Did you look at remittances as well?
Yeah, yeah. So we got remittances and food gifts as well. So there's actually, and this is one of the hypotheses as we do, so we've done about 3 surveys now in these secondary, tertiary cities. And what we found is that those households have more food gifts or food flowing from a proximal area from a family member into the urban household. So we're capturing those to the extent we can. But often the remittances are going from the urban household back to the rural area. Yeah.
So, sorry, what would you use as a, what in your opinion is the best outcome indicator of vulnerability if you were to select one? Or are you already thinking about combining them into a composite indicator?
I think some kind of index that combines labor and labor regularity and food consumption would tell us more than just food consumption. Both in terms of kind of short-term and long-term strategies. Probably because there's all kinds of things that individuals are spending money on besides just food. Like school fees, obviously, are a huge impact, and that has a seasonality dimension to it. So we see, I think, some impacts on those kinds of temporal dynamics.
Did you check if the reference markets were exactly those of the neighborhood, or if households perhaps might have different consumption habits, perhaps going somewhere else because on a daily basis they have to commute inside the city, the town, and perhaps also check for a better market?
Yeah. So we did ask not just did you buy from an open air market versus a street vendor, but we got the name of the market where they purchased food from. And yeah, we didn't pick up, like we would kind of need individual level data to get those commuters who are working somewhere else, buying food, bringing it back. We tried to get at the transportation networks where if they took a bus back to this point here, and this market is on the way as they walk from the bus stop back to their household over here, was that playing into where they were purchasing food? But we haven't done that depth of spatial analysis yet, but definitely people are, I think the vast majority of individuals are buying food from the most proximal market, the closest market, and it's only a small proportion of food purchases that are coming from some other kind of market location. It does happen, but it's a relatively small proportion.
Did you find some kind of relation between the amount of vendors in a neighborhood and the food security?
We haven't analyzed
somehow
those
similar
data.
to the literature of food deserts in the States or something like that.
Yeah, so we haven't analyzed the data enough to be able to say convincingly. Just based on anecdotally, I would say the bigger impact is on these kinds of policy moves where for public health reasons, there might be this event where they take all the street vendors out of a particular residential area, like with the cholera outbreak. And we would talk to really low income, I was totally shocked that we were talking to some really low income households who said that they were now switching to buying food from a supermarket, a ShopRite, where the food is maybe twice as much as expensive, but they had really locked into that mindset of the supermarket being quote unquote safer food than the street vendor or open air market food, which also is a bit of a myth, I think you can say. But yeah, we haven't analyzed the data to know whether the presence of street vendors results in lower priced food. We probably need more markets and more street vendors. We only did the street vendor analysis in 4 residential areas.
Okay. Yeah. I saw that you mentioned that you did something on essential food basket. How did you, agree on this essential basket?
So we haven't computed that ourselves. I was just talking earlier about there's data sources that have computed these food needs baskets in Zambia. So those data are available, but we've been collecting some kind of we ask what the total expenditures from the household were on major expenditures, and school fees always are mentioned. But we haven't done this total needs food basket assessment as part of our analysis. But those do exist by secondary data sources in Zambia. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.